Now, somebody who will have a particular issue on this will be the Asthma Respiratory Foundation. Of course, asthmatics and those with respiratory issues have always smoked, despite suffering from asthma and respiratory conditions. And I guess vaping was seen as a much more, a less harmful consequence. But they will still have a view, and joining us from the foundation is Letitia. Letitia, good afternoon to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good afternoon, Michael.
I think I've summarised that all right, haven't I? Initially, vaping was seen as not the silver bullet, but a sort of much better alternative, wasn't it?
From the Foundation's perspective, no. From back in 2017, we obviously have international connections, and the US was going down this path for a few years prior to where New Zealand was. So, we raised concerns about this issue way back then.
And what were your concerns?
Concerns were that there needed to be regulation so that youth didn't take up vaping, and also that there was concerns around the harm of vaping, and particularly around, the tagline that was being touted from the Public Health England around 95% safer. So, we met with the Ministry on numerous occasions talking about our issues with this, and unfortunately we are where we are today, and we're sort of trying to pick up the pieces.
Now, you mentioned the date 2017. Why is that important, that date, Letitia?
That's important because it's when the Vaping Expert Advisory Group was put together to basically talk with the ministry and help lead, regulation around vaping in New Zealand and the products. And we actually tried to get some of our respiratory physicians. We've got 14 scientific advisory board members who basically are respiratory leaders in their field from all around New Zealand. We were concerned about the makeup of that advisory group because a third were from industry.
Okay, so, organisations like ASH and others at that time, they were suggesting that vaping was, and so was the Ministry of Health, as I remember, a sort of pathway from the more serious, what they regarded as cigarette and tobacco smoking. Was that the argument as to why vaping was allowed in 2017 to continue as it was?
Yeah, correct. But we're also heavily influenced by Public Health England and the public health sort of sector, and certainly the ministry and ASH. We're looking at those figures and stats which are coming out of Public Health England. So that was the idea, that they would be useful for people to quit smoking. But actually the evidence suggests that only really happened when you had wraparound services and intense, behavioural support, because giving up smoking is hard. It's damn hard, Nicotine is one of the most difficult products to give up. It's hugely addictive.
Right, so I can still vape and get my nicotine. I'm just not putting all that carcinogenic stuff in my lungs. But is there evidence that vaping makes my lungs worse anyhow?
Yeah, absolutely. It does. And actually, in New Zealand, we find that adult smokers, who are using vapes, they're actually doing both. So they'll dual use vapes and cigarettes, around 64%. And that's actually worse than smoking alone. So there's that issue. There's not been enough push for smokers to actually get off the vapes as well and give up both. But we do have evidence. Now there is abundant evidence out there on the effects of vaping on the lungs, on the circulatory system, the nicotine and brain development in youth. So we've got plenty of evidence out there that vaping as a standalone product does cause harm. And, we don't want our kids taking up vaping.
No, I understand that. But doesn't vaping have an R18 facility already, that you're not meant to be vaping if you're under the age of 18?
Yeah, that's true. That's right. It is. But, there's ways that you can buy it online. You just have to click you're over 18. That's one avenue. We know that there isn't a lot of enforcement out there of checking to see that people are actually adhering to those rules, that are selling it. And, I've spoken with the Minister of Health on, capping the specialist vape retailers that we've got out there. Less than 2 weeks ago, there was 1,249 specialist vape retailers. I checked it today before this interview, 1,271 specialist vape retailers.
Wow. So these are, when you say specialist, you mean it's their primary purpose is to sell vapes?
No, not necessarily. So you have to register in the ministry portal that you want to be a specialist vape retailer, which means you have to sell over 70% of your products are in vapes. However, what we're finding that there's a loophole is that convenience stores can petition off part of their convenience store and create a specialist vape retailer.
Right. Okay. So that's just one person dedicated to selling vapes in their store or something like that.
Yeah, it'll be registered as a separate sort of, organisation under that blanket, but it's a separate area that sells over 70% of vapes, and that's a loophole, and that's what we're definitely seeing, especially in a lot of the smaller towns. There was 13 up in Dargaville, 29 down in Tairāwhiti. We don't need all these specialist vape retailers, and unfortunately, one of the things we're calling for is to actually cap them. Why are we letting this happen? And unfortunately, the minister has said, no, we're not capping them. Why?
Well, there's the question. I mean, you're based in Wellington, I presume. The minister, Aisha Verrill, comes from a medical background, so presumably she's got the latest clinical advice available to her. Is the problem that she is getting advice from the Ministry of Health in opposition to yours?
I think that the background to where this started is an issue, because it was described as the panacea for people to help quit smoking, and I think that they've gone down this path. They've certainly gone down a different path that Australia has gone down, and so now it's very, very hard to U-turn, but it's not impossible. I've had conversations, and, we could just stop and cap the amount of specialist vape retailers, and we could actually ban disposable vapes, because we know those are actually, the most common that our youth use.
Mm. No, and the Australians have done it, as you say. Can I also say, just to share with you, but I mean something you already know, Letitia, and that is that my children, who are teenagers, considerable, and they're at 3 different schools, or they were at 3 different schools, they report significant vape use amongst the kind of boys and girls that would have smoked. So in other words, the argument is that there's a certain type of personality, socioeconomic group, risk taker maybe, who is attracted to smoking through that, or sort of vaping through their adolescence times, in exactly the same way that I would have identified some of my peers as being obvious smokers back then. Do you follow that logic, or do you go, nah, it's not directed at a certain group, it's everybody that's at risk?
No, it's everybody that's at risk. And, all of the evidence, all of the studies, all the survey, ASH survey, the Secretary Principals and Asthma and Respiratory Foundation survey, the health survey, we've got 20% of our 14 and 15-year-olds who are regularly vaping. That's 1 in 5. So, this isn't just a particular group. And we were already, if you look at the ASH Year 10 survey, we're already pushing those rates of smoking way, way down, way before, the vapes came on the market. So, that's a false argument. And, we would disagree with that.
I just have to say, the 4 out of 5, 15-year-olds, or probably the majority of teens, don't vape. If they're so freely and easily available, then they must have made, you would expect, some sort of conscious choice not to. Yeah,
I think there's more education. It's something we've been pushing in schools and working with other groups like Education Trust, etc., to really get that message out there. But I think the difference is also the potency of the nicotine that in these products, and I've got 5 children similar ages, it's different to the cigarettes that you were talking about back in our day, because we're talking about nicotine of 50 milligrams per mil in a vape in one of the pens, the disposable pens. Now, to put that in perspective, that is a pack and a half of cigarettes. If you're a current smoker who smokes a pack a day, 20 milligrams is what they say you need for that nicotine to help get off that with behavioural therapy. So, the potency and the ease and how they can just take a vape or a hoon, they call it, take that, put it in your pocket, have another one. It's not like a cigarette which burns out. So I think that's also a big difference.
Okay, so we've had people ring on this, adults obviously on the show as well, who've rung in and said, listen, vaping makes much more sense for me. It's got me off smoking, and so it's working in that sense. It's also cheaper, and they still get the same nicotine hit and things like that. I take it that your aim, or the aim of the foundation, is not to ban vaping, but to simply restrict and have much stronger regulations around its use?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've always been saying that, for the smokers who have failed on the FDA-approved products, your patches, etc., then vaping may be something that works for them, and that's fantastic. We want people to quit smoking, but this is now a separate issue completely, and that's what we're dealing in. That's the space that we're in, because we have empathy for the parents who ring up saying, my kid is vaping in the shower, goes to bed is vaping. Their behaviour's changed. We're concerned about that. So I like to see it as now a completely standalone issue. I mean, Ash's done a wonderful job with educating around the anti-smoking and pushing that. But, we have to take responsibility that we've let this happen in New Zealand. And, for those kids, those 1 in 5 who are dependent on these vapes, we're letting them down.
No, I understand your argument. I'm just fascinated by what the policy response is, because yes, you would assume that the so-called industry would be running a sort of a counter-argument, although they themselves surely wouldn't be promoting use to under 18-year-olds. But as you say, they're getting it from somewhere and they're buying it relatively freely. Have you tried the other political parties leading into this election?
Yeah, that's a good point. We have reached out. I think that there's going to be more of a groundswell now. There's a lot of groups that are in the space saying we need to do something. So I think the more noise out there, it may be an election point. There's many, of course, election points, but this is a good one to try and stop. So the proliferation of the youth epidemic that we do have. So I mean,
have you met Shane Reti, for example, the National Health spokesperson?
Yes, I met Shane Reti early on when this was first coming out, and of course, I think everybody in the ministry that we're talking to, we're looking at vapes being the answer for people to quit smoking. And we knew that, Maori were particularly higher smoking rates than Europeans, or New Zealand, Pākehā. So I think that, everyone was on that page, and that's when we started to stop the advertising. That's when we started pushing for that. That's when the R18, regulations came in. But we've got to go further now. That's the problem, and I'm hoping that everybody's listening and we make these changes.
So if I've got a kid, I don't thankfully, but if I did have a teenager who was vaping, and I think you make a very valid point that if you can acquire them so easily, they could easily become addicted to nicotine, and you don't want that necessarily to occur. What's the solution?
Yeah, that's the other thing. Unfortunately, and we have a fantastic Māori community who is the first one we appointed because of this issue down in Te in the Gisborne region, because there is very limited resources out there for kids who are now dependent on these vapes. The quit line, it's not a focus for them, and so we're letting them down as well. That's a huge issue for us. We wanted the government to put money into helping our kids who are dependent on these vapes, and they let the door open on this so readily to have that support to do that. And I think that's a focus area that needs to be looked at strongly.
And just changing the topic for a second, you're also Asthma and Respiratory Foundation. There is just talking to people over the last year on the show, one of the things that's come up is a belief that asthma and asthmatics have got greater in number and proportionality than 20, 30, 50 years ago. What's your research show on that in regards of New Zealanders?
I don't think we've seen an increase, and we're still looking at 1 in 8 adults and 1 in 8 children having asthma, but I think that it's 1 in 8. So it's still, it's prolific here, but I think the thing is that there's more awareness about that. We put out the national guidelines for adolescents and adult management of asthma, so it's more prevalent. The pharmaceuticals and the drugs to help manage it better. There's more out there, but the problem is that there's no cure for asthma. So it's all around how do you manage it better. And I think there's probably more of an awareness about that. But actually, it's similar. It's been similar for many years.
And finally, someone's just got some text me to follow the money. The people who make the money out of vapes, are they the same companies that purvey tobacco? Are they tobacco companies? Or have you got a whole group of new retailers and producers in this space?
Well, it's a good question, because actually if you do follow the money, there is a lot of money from big tobacco backing this, and there's a lot of influence from big tobacco supporting public awareness around youth and not wanting them to get addicted, So there's programs that even Big Tobacco runs, which is something from their old gameplay book. But the value of the Asia Pacific region, which is a key target of tobacco companies, nearly doubled US $1.4 billion between 2014 and 18, and it's going to grow even further to $2.2 billion in 2019, doubled again in $4.4 billion in 2021, and overall the market's predicted to worth about $43 billion. So big tobacco is hugely involved and invested in this, because, as was famously quoted by executives, in the 1960s, big tobacco is in the business of nicotine, not cigarettes.
Well, and it's interesting actually, because I was researching for this and I read a piece, I think it was in the Sydney Morning Herald, it might have been the Australian, only a couple of weeks ago, when the Australians were looking at this, and they were saying that there are entire factories now that are given over in China making vapes and disposable vapes as well. So obviously there would be some, now that's not run by a tobacco company, they're run by a state government and corporations. So do you think that's an aspect of this as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this is big money, and let's face it, big tobacco is not altruistic. They're in it for the money. You've got 2 or 3 of your smokers long term end up dying from smoking related illnesses. So you've got to have a new generation addicted to nicotine, right, in products. So I don't think this is opening anyone's eyes.
Listen, this is a fascinating conversation, because when I said to you about a certain type of personality, a certain type of kid, and they were the kids that smoked when I was at school, you said, no, it's more than that. But yet I'm hearing in the back of what you're saying there also, you talked about tyrophy, and I'm thinking, because that's a high cannabis using area. There are obviously, as you know, all the usual problems that attend lower socioeconomic groups and things like that. Do people vape and get addicted to nicotine in part of the same reason that, I don't know, the working class in England drank cheap gin from Holland to try and escape reality?
I think that with these products, and especially what's happened in the past, if you go back to the 1960s and 1950s, actually cigarette smoking was sort of an upper class thing. And that's often how it starts, because it starts there and then it infiltrates and becomes normalised. And I think that's certainly an area we're concerned with. The vaping, if you look at the figures that have come out with the ASH Year 10 survey, Maori girls, for them, regular vaping rates went from 19% in 2019 to 41% in 2021 and 40% in 2022. So, I think that there is some argument around that, but it's the normalisation of these products. That's the problem. We see them in movies and Netflix. They're also, of course, huge sponsors, the cigarette companies, of F1. So, it just starts being normalised, and especially for our kids, from across the board, they see all this. And the influence on social media is huge, and that's really hard to check. So you get influencers who are puffing away on these vapes and doing amazing tricks, and they do look amazing. That's incredibly hard. And of course, everybody watches that. All of the kids are watching like TikTok and on the social media. So, it's a big picture. It's not an easy thing, but what we can do now is actually cap the specialist vape retailers, limit the amount of nicotine to 20 milligrams, which is in line with Europe and the EU. And we need to then just, we need to really ban those disposable vapes because they have those high content nicotine.
Okay. Well, listen, I can see this is going to be an ongoing issue. Can't imagine you giving up on the advocacy, Letitia, or your foundation. Can I just suggest to you that I would definitely ask the political parties leading into this election campaign what their position is taking into election. Seems a good way of putting some pressure on.
It's a good suggestion, Michael. We will.
Okay, thank you, Letitia. Nice to join you. Thank you very much for joining us. It's Letitia Harding, who's the Chief Executive of the Asthma and Respiratory Foundation. I've been after that interview for a long, long time because the Australians banned it a month ago, I think, in New Zealand. Aisha Verrill almost too quickly said, no, we're not going to do that. I'm not going to follow the Australians at all. And I went, that's an odd thing to say. So obviously they've been talking about it. But then as I was developing that interview and I was thinking through and just, you have little thought pods that sort of break apart as you suddenly led down a particular thought path or logic path. But I was thinking, do you agree at home that the kind of kids that would vape are unlikely to be your top academics or your top sporting people? Although there were always those kids, I guess, that will. There will always be some kids. It is a certain type of risk-taking adolescent, the same types that would have smoked anyhow. And then that whole socioeconomic thing. And I was thinking when Letitia just mentioned 41% of Maori girls taking up vaping. And I was thinking, I wonder if there's some pushback somewhere from some Maori policymakers who are saying, you're trying to take something away from us. I don't know. Your thoughts? 0800. Yes, and Craig says, did we just hear your dog and his squeaky toy, Michael? You did. And it's a she. And it's a Jack Russell. So if you ever want to know what ADHD looks like, or ADD personified in a species, try a Jack Russell.